This is Talkish. I am Halli Casser-Jayne. Talkish is available at hallicasser-jayne.com. Hey, we've all heard it said 1,000 times, laughter is the best medicine. And so, in the interest of health today, I bring you a chuckle or two, hopefully more. When joining me at my table is the author of Life is a Joke, 100 Life Lessons with Punchlines, Gordon Javna, and Jeremy Dauber, the author of Jewish comedy, A Serious History. That's not all that serious. It's time for Talkish. Let's get to it. Beginning with my conversation with Gordon Javna. Did you hear the one about the Italian chef? He passed away. Bada bada bing. Did you laugh at the classic one-liner? Maybe, maybe not so much. Jokes. Who writes this stuff? And what is the difference between a good joke and a great joke? According to brothers Gordon and John Javna, a great joke not only will make you laugh, a great joke will make you think. Jokes, they assert, are portals of discovery. They can get a message across in a way that is clear, humorous, and often practical. A work of wit and wisdom, Life is a Joke straddles self-help and entertainment. Comical and thought-provoking, Life is a Joke is the perfect marriage of the two, containing 100 valuable lessons on how to live, drawn from 100 hilarious and unforgettable jokes. It's time for Talkish. Let's talk. Hi, Gordon.
Hi, Hallie. How are you?
I'm terrific. How about you?
I am okay.
Okay.
I am
Just okay.
Getting over a cold.
Oh, that's not good.
No, I'm getting over a cold.
Yeah, I hear you. But laughter is the best medicine. So what do we...
There you go.
So
Boom, boom. Oh, that was
bada,
good.
bada, boom, right? So here we go.
Yeah, that was it.
All right, I got to ask you first, is life a joke? Love the title of your book.
Thank you. Well, the title of the book is, we have life wisdom, life lessons in the book. So, and we extract them from jokes and teach them from jokes. And so that is the point of the title. But I have to say, you shouldn't take life any more seriously than you have to. You have to have an attitude of whatever happens, because there's so much you can't control.
Ain't that the truth? So tell me how this book came about. I mean, what were you and your brothers sitting around one night and a light kind of went off and you had an aha moment and you said, Eureka, jokes are like fairy tales? Because that's what this book is really about. It's about jokes, fairy tales. They're great stories, but they're stories with meaning. Both are meant to teach. But I never thought that way about jokes until I picked up your book. So jokes, fairy tales?
Well, I'm glad you got that, because that is exactly what you described is almost exactly what happened. John and I, we both have been in the book publishing business for a while, and so when we sit around over a cup of coffee or down at the coffee shop, because we live nearby each other, and when we sit at the coffee shop, we invariably end up talking about, oh, this would be a good idea for a book, or that would be a good idea for a book. And I just casually mentioned that I would like to do a self-help book someday, because I'm a big fan of self-help books. I need all the help I can get, and I like getting little bits of wisdom that delivered to me is something I can use, hopefully. And I mentioned this to John, and he said, I have been, for years, he said, I have used jokes to impart lessons to my children because they don't respond when I preach at them or when I yell at them to do something. He said, but when I tell them, use a punchline from a joke as the sort of activator for teaching them, then they pay attention. And so we just looked at each other and we said, is it possible to combine these ideas and turn a series of jokes into life lessons that are accessible to everyone? Could we possibly put together a combination joke book and self-help book?
And here it is.
And it was literally, the light went off. Boing! It's like, has anybody done this before? No. We looked it up. Nobody had ever done this before. Excuse me. So we started thinking about it. We realized, it's not such a stretch, because a good joke is a little story. It's a little tale. It has characters. It has a plot. It has a twisting ending. And if it's told well, if it's paced well, the reader can get into it for that brief period, just the way you would get into a good fable or a parable or some other kind of story. So then we started collecting the jokes. We decided to use classic jokes because, just because that's how we decided to do it. And we used all the jokes we could think of that worked for this purpose, and then we started asking friends and family to tell us their favorite jokes. And
the rest, as they say, is history. You got a whole book.
Yeah.
A whole book.
Yep.
Listen to me. So I don't know how much you were into the joke world prior to this. So I imagine you had to do a lot of study to even find the ones, as you said, that you were going to use in the book or whatever. But you also probably had to study the art of jokes, if you will. What makes a joke funny?
Well, I think it is telling a story that rings true. It has to have a certain element of slapstick in it. You know, somebody has to get gonged. You know, somebody usually is the butt of a joke.
Right, there you go.
Yeah, and if it's well paced, you can be there, and you can be one of either the victim or the perpetrator. But it's, you know, and it has to have an element of truth in order for you to relate to it. And
so, is there a recipe for a good joke? I mean, is it like Grandma's Christmas
I don't know if there's a recipe per se, but funny words help. You know, using funny words and pacing, I think, is key to telling a joke, making a joke funny.
No, here I thought, Gordon, you were going to give me the recipe for sure, and then I was going to retire from the talk business and become the next Joan Rivers. No recipe for the perfect joke.
Well, 1 part truth, 2 parts funny characters, 1 part unusual situation, 1 part misdirection, because the unusual situation is not apparent at the beginning. You set it up with things that are very familiar, such as in this joke. Okay, so there's a guy's walking down a country road, and he comes upon a farmhouse. Now this is okay. So there's your setup is very believable, and he standing in front of the farmhouse is the farmer and a pig, and the pig has a wooden leg, and the man says, "Nice pig you got there." And the farmer says, "Nice? This pig is great." He said, "This is the greatest pig that ever was. I'll tell you how great this pig is." He says, "A couple of years ago, I was in the barn, and a couple of giant bales of hay fell out of the loft and crushed me on the ground. I was suffocating. And this pig came running in to the barn, grabbed me by the foot, and dragged me out. Saved my life." The man said, "That's amazing." He said, "Yeah, I'll tell you, that's just the beginning." He said, "Last year, my house caught fire, and this pig ran into the burning building, found my 2 kids in their room, and pulled them out to safety. Saved their lives." And the man says, "That's truly amazing. Truly amazing." He said, "But I got to ask you, what's with the wooden leg?" And the farmer says, "Well, with a pig like that, that's a special pig. You don't eat a pig like that all at once."
Oh, no. Oh, God. I'm a great audience, and you're terrific. You just told that I'm suffering from pneumonia.
Well, I'm not dying. I'm suffering, but I'm not dying.
So truly, laughter is the best medicine, which, by the way, laughter is, and that's one of the great joys of listening to good jokes, right? Because it heals.
Indeed it is. Yeah.
Right? But and then you guys get into the meaning of what's found behind the joke, and even the exploration of into the insight that a funny story can.
Well, the life lesson from that joke is that we would like to believe that anytime we do something for someone, they're going to express appreciation. And very often usually people will. They'll say thank you, and they'll be genuine about it. They'll mean it. But not always. Sometimes people are unable to express appreciation, and in some cases, completely unable. In fact, they might appreciate what you're doing for them, in some level, but they really see you as a resource for them to exploit. And we all have had that experience at work or in our personal relationships. So you risk, like the farmer, you risk being eaten piece by piece unless you have the good sense to get yourself out of that situation. In other words, don't be the pig. And then we have some tips for how to recognize when you're being taken advantage of.
It's brilliant. It really is brilliant, I'm telling you. And it made me think. And let me tell you what it made me think, right? There's a lesson in every joke, but a joke in every lesson as well.
Could be.
Well, think about life. You started off as, the first thing I think you said to me, and one of the early things you said to me was, you gotta keep laughing, right?
Yep.
So I think it works both ways, and maybe that's what the magic of it is, because there is something magical about jokes. You ever watch like little kids or watch an audience in a live performance when somebody's telling a joke? That is when people are the most focused of anything that they do. I swear. Think about it. You just keep going in with them and in with them and in with them until you get to the punchline. It's fascinating to me.
And people do like to be entertained.
No doubt.
That is sort of a basic thing about human beings, is that we all like to be entertained. We appreciate a good laugh because, I don't know, maybe it has to do with being given something.
Oh, that's interesting.
Maybe we like to be the recipient, or maybe we just crave that, connection with the joke teller.
Here's a question. What does somebody's response to a joke tell you about them?
If somebody laughs hysterically at a joke, or even, if somebody groans at a joke, I know they got it. If they laugh hysterically at a joke, I know they're laughing with me, and they get it thoroughly. A groaner, they might not appreciate it quite as much as I do, but they do get it. But you can see in someone's eyes right away whether they got it or not. And I guess what it tells me is whether they have a sense of humor and whether they are relaxed enough to allow themselves to laugh at themselves, because that's key to good jokes. Is that you have to be able to laugh at yourself, because you're going to see yourself in that joke somewhere. So in all the research and all the jokes that you were listening to and all the lessons that you could garner for all of this, what was the big lesson you learned? Well, we included a lot of wisdom that came from my father. Our father, who just turned 99 a couple of months ago.
Ooh, Mazel tov.
Loved. Thank you. He loved to tell us not just jokes, but little proverbs, and he would describe things with these sort of cliched phrases. And this, I don't know if you'd say this taught me this, but it taught me to appreciate him, because we ended up including a lot of his bits of wisdom in the book, and that was a lot of fun. I mean, that was a real pleasure to be able to do that. We quoted him a few times and referred to lessons that he taught us. That was kind of cool.
You and your brother wrote this book together, John. You've written a lot together. Who's the funnier of the two of you? I'll let him listen to this one when it's done.
Well,
Are you funny?
Except
for when you cough.
He's pretty funny.
He's a funny guy?
Sorry about that.
No.
He's pretty funny.
Yeah.
But
you're funnier.
I'm funnier.
So listen to me, Gordon.
Yeah.
Always leave him laughing. You know that line, right? So you told your one joke. Play us off with one other one.
So two pirates are sitting around a bar, swapping war stories and talking about their battle scars. And one says, "Where'd you get the hook on your hand?" He said, "Well, I got that after a battle in the West Indies. We were ransacking a merchant ship, and the captain ship sliced off my hand with his sword, and I got this hook." And the other pirate says, "Oh, it's interesting, amazing. And tell me, where'd you get the peg leg?" I said, "Well, we were down off of Haiti. We were we were ransacking a schooner, and the captain of that ship got into hand-to-hand combat with me, and he took a swipe at me with his sword, and he so hard that he cut my leg off. I got this peg leg. And the first pirate says, well, where'd you get the patch over your right eye? He goes, I got that one when I was walking out on the deck of a ship, and a seagull flew by and crapped in my eye. And the first pirate says, what? That's how you got the patch on your eye? He goes, well, it was my first day with the hook.
He left me laughing, folks. I've been speaking with Gordon Javna. Gordon and John Javna are the Javna brothers. Their book is Life is a Joke, 100 Lessons with Punchlines, available at Amazon.com and fine bookstores everywhere. You are listening to Talkish with Halli Casser-Jayne, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are Gordon Javna, the co-author of Life is a Joke, 100 Lessons with Punchlines, and Jeremy Dauber, the author of Jewish Comedy, A Serious History. Talkish with Halli Casser-Jayne posts new podcasts Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern at hallicasser-jayne.com. The age-old question, are the Jewish people funnier than everyone else? And if they are, why? If not, are they almost as funny as everyone else? Bada bada bing. The truth be told, over the last half-century, the Jewish people have become known for humor, and perhaps for a particular kind of humor. Carl Reiner, Mel Brooks, Joan Rivers, Groucho Marx, Woody Allen, Sarah Silverman, Larry David, Nichols and May, Jerry Seinfeld, and Jon Stewart are just a few names we recognize. But the story of Jewish comedy is as vast and variegated as the many Jewish comics and their individual style, so that if it resolutely resists any single explanatory lens, it is also surely a tradition. In his new book, Jewish Comedy, A Serious History, Jeremy Dauber, a professor of Yiddish language, literature, and culture at Columbia University, explores, defines, and catalogs the history of Jewish humor, what it did, and what it meant for Jews in different times and places. A history that encompasses the story of the American popular culture, of Jewish civilization, and of the essential comic impulse in human behavior. The history of these strands taking on a journey through both historical and contemporary Judaism. It's time for Talkish. Let's talk. All right, Jeremy, enter laughing. Not to put you on the spot, but I'm gonna. What's your favorite example of Jewish humor?
There are so many great jokes, but I think one of my favorites, I think one that sort of says a whole lot about the Jewish condition, is this one where Mrs. Goldberg is walking on the beach with her grandson. Now, you probably know this joke. But she's walking on the beach with her grandson, and a big wave comes and washes the grandson out to sea. And Mrs. Goldberg, she falls down to the ground on the sand, and she holds up reaches out her hands to heaven, and she prays and she cries and says, "Oh God, God, bring my grandson back to me." And this hand, comes out of the sky and goes into the water and picks up the grandson and deposits him, dripping wet but unharmed, onto the beach. And she looks up at the heavens and she reaches out her hands and she says, he had a hat.
Oh, God.
That's one of my favorites.
I'm a good audience. Yeah, trust me.
You're a good laugh. Very important.
I grew up in Englewood where you kind of grew up, and I'm laughing because do you know how many comedians, Jewish comedians, came out of Englewood? I mean, Richie Lewis is one. Did you know that?
I did not know that Richie Lewis.
One of my best friends growing up lived right around the corner from where you folks live, and Joey Bishop lived around the other corner.
Oh, well,
there you go.
That about Joey Bishop, but I did not know about that about Richard Lewis. That's
amazing. I call him Richie because he was Richie. He's older than I am. He was my sister's age. But yeah, how interesting is that? There's something in the water in Englewood, I guess. A question: are Jewish people funnier than everyone else?
It's a good question. I've been asked this, and I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not even sure exactly how one would go about answering it. But I do think that there is something in the circumstances of Jewish history that have created a very particular kind of comedy, and that's the sort of thing that I sort of investigated in the book.
And investigated well, I might add. Listen, although I know there are many answers to the following question that I'm about to ask you, because there are many questions, actually, as there have been Jewish comics over the course of history, now that I think about it. But I'm going to ask you why. Why are Jews funny? And I want to say to you this. I once asked Carl Reiner that question. I'm not going to give you what his answer was until after, if you want to know, until after you answer me. But is there an overarching answer?
I don't know if there's an answer to why are Jews funny, because, again, that implies that, Jews are funny in a way that other people aren't funny, right? Or that other people aren't funny or other groups aren't funny. And I don't know whether that's, I would want to make that case. What I do think is that there are particular circumstances of the way in which Jews are funny. And that, a lot of that has to do with the fact that here is this people who have had sort of grand historical and theological imaginings, like in that joke I told before. They get to talk to God, right? And yet they have something to complain about, maybe less than the grandmother does, right? But they have this special relationship, they're the chosen people. They have this particular history. They feel themselves to be sort of specially designated. And at the same time, history doesn't seem to bear out that they're so special, right? Go choose somebody else, as Shalom Aleichem once said.
Yeah, I know, but a lot of that can be interpreted a different way, too. Maybe not special, the chosen people, because of some of the negative that had happened. But on the other hand, who else could have survived? Dalek, all of this. I mean, I can't imagine. But I do think that's a fair question to ask, because I do think there is something very unique about Jewish humor, which accounts for the fact that you could write a whole book about it, and a good book at that, by the way, and just phenomenally well written. And it made me think. But I want to say this to you also, in defining Jewish humor, and I think that does help us. Different forms of comedy. There's slapstick. There's anecdotal. There's black comedy. There's insult humor. There's sketch. Jews are great at sketch. But is that something specific to Jewish humor, different, let's say, than Catholic humor? Or if there's such a difference, WASP humor, who I think are less humor-filled than we Jews. What makes a Jewish joke? And by the way, who has the right to tell them? Only Jews? Talk to me. It's a lot in there.
There's a lot in there. There is a lot in there. I think that, one of the things I had to do when I set out to write the book was to sort of say, to draw some kind of circle around what I was going to talk about. What was Jewish humor, right? And because, as it is so capacious in any possible definition. But and then the two lines that I drew were one, which seems more obvious, I think, that Jewish comedy has to be produced by Jews. However they tend to identify themselves, that I was less concerned about. But, they have to sort of identify themselves as Jewish people. But the other, more importantly, was that it had to speak to some aspect of the Jewish historical or cultural experience. That was something that that was important. So if there was a great knock-knock joke that was told by, a Mr. Schwartz, that wouldn't come in, right? And so, a lot of comedy of Jews through the ages, has been written for shows or for routines that doesn't say anything particularly Jewish. And so that part I didn't include. Even so, that left a remarkable amount of material that really did speak to the kind of Jewish historical experience. And what I said was that, I didn't want to have any one particular definition of Jewish comedy, because that I think happens a lot, is that people say Jewish comedy is, and they say, well, it's clearly a response to anti-Semitism. And my response to that was, well, some Jewish comedy is absolutely a response to anti-Semitism, but there's lots of examples that immediately suggest themselves that aren't. And so I came up with all of these different kinds of general groupings or what I called strands in the book of Jewish comedy that had a historical tradition, and I sort of told their story in the book. I think that once you look at that, you sort of see that almost any of those categories, whether it's about sort of witty allusion from literature or kind of vulgar body humor or some relationship with theology, almost all of these in one way or another could be told by other groups, but they wouldn't be told in the same way or sometimes with the same poignancy or the same historical memory or circumstance as in the Jewish case. And so I think that's what makes, the Jewish humor particularly unique and special, but African American humor is also particularly unique and special. I don't want to make a distinction between those uniquenesses or specialnesses. That said, I think the second question, I'm not sure it's the second or the fifth,
10th,
the 10th, right? But
I'm Jewish,
right? But exactly right. But I do think that there was, there's this important question that's become increasingly pressing and powerful now in the last couple of years, of who gets to tell particular jokes, who gets to make particular comedy. And I think that is a question that people are really still trying to figure out right now. I mean, I think that Jerry Seinfeld in a wonderful episode of the show Seinfeld. There was the episode where his dentist converted to Judaism. I don't know if you saw this episode or you remember it. But Jerry has the sneaking suspicion that he converted to Judaism so that he could tell Jewish jokes with impunity. And he goes around and, all of his friends think he's crazy and all this. And finally, he ends up speaking to a priest in a confessional booth. One of the few times that Jerry on the show sort of talks about being Jewish explicitly. And the priest says, "Oh, so this must offend you as a Jew." And he says, "No, it offends me as a comedian." That the conversion takes place, and that's sort of the capper of the episode. This idea that for Seinfeld, I think both as a show and as a person, really what mattered was kind of the comedy and sort of what you do in terms of telling the joke, as opposed to sort of being offended Jewishly. And I think that this is important, particularly in today's entertainment landscape, where you have a lot of people in a collaborative efforts in writers' rooms and what have you, sort of putting together, let's say, a Jewish show like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend or Broad City or now the Fabulous Mrs. Maisels, and not all of them are Jewish, but they're all kind of pitching Jewish jokes. So I think that these kind of questions become different from, for example, someone on a stand-up telling a kind of Jewish mother joke or something like that.
You know what else? I wonder what happens when the left and the right coast, maybe Chicago, a lot of Jews. All these things are taken. I wonder how it comes off, and it's hard. Somebody like myself or you, even, it would be difficult for us to understand. If we were in one of the flyover states, how they perceive it. Who is Woody Allen to them? Do they get it? Is it universal Jewish humor, or is it specific?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it's an essential question. And we have some knowledge about this as case studies of this. So for example, a lot of people who I talk to, in my audiences, and the vast majority of people who come to hear me speak are Jewish, although I should now add that the book is a wonderful read for everybody, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. You don't have to be Jewish to like the book. But many of the people sort of say, for example, "Oh, Jack Benny, he was so Jewish in his comedy. Jerry Seinfeld was such a Jewish show." And it seems pretty clear that a lot of people did not think, a lot of, Jack Benny's massive radio audience and television audience did not particularly see him as Jewish. A lot of people looking at Seinfeld did not particularly see the show as deeply Jewish. They just thought of Seinfeld, for example, as a very kind of crazy New Yorker kind of cosmopolitan kind of thing. And I think what this gets to is something which is often true in almost any kind of layered or textured work of comedy, as opposed to a simple joke where there's a binary, do you get what's going on or not, of some of the simplest kind of jokes, where there are multiple levels of enjoyment to any kind of artistic product, comedy very much included. And some people get some levels and other people get other levels. I'm a big fan, for example, of the television show Blackish. My wife and I watch this all the time. I am sure that there are jokes that are going over my head because I'm not familiar as deeply with whatever particular in-jokes or what have you maybe are being made in this, for different sub-communities. And that's fine. I'm still really having a great time watching the show and learning, interesting things and having, being entertained.
Right. And I think it's interesting also because I think what happens is it then thus makes the Jewish humor universal, which opens gaps between different parts of our culture. Because if they're not even getting mensch humor, is what I call a lot of it, they're understanding something, even if they can't name what it is. Seinfeld doesn't look Jewish to you, to this person, but he's New York and Jew. I don't know. They seem to be synonymous to a lot of people.
Well, I think, I think that universality that you're talking about is very important on two grounds. I mean, I think the first is that it's the sign of any kind of great work of art, that it comes from sort of a particularity, someone's particular circumstances as an artist or a person, but then reaches and touches on things that are universal. My last book, as you know, was about Shalom Aleichem, and who wrote the series of stories that became Fiddler on the Roof. And Fiddler on the Roof is, of course, a very Jewish cultural work. It's hard to find something that's in some ways more Jewish, and yet, of course, it had universal resonance, and that's the reason that it's been put on all over the world. And people say things like, as someone said to one of my teachers, "I can't believe Fiddler on the Roof was originally from Yiddish stories. It seems so Japanese." and meant it. So I think,
yeah.
And then the second side of sort of this universality is that, in many ways, sort of more explicit presentations of Jewishness on television, especially, but in other kinds of things, really, go a long way towards sort of increasing a certain kind of universality, saying, well, these people they're like us, right? Maybe we haven't met, a Jew in person, or maybe we've only met one or two, but we see, Ross on Friends or whoever, or Richard Lewis, right? And there are things that are relatable about this, and that changes, my attitude somewhat. And certainly, with the increased presentation in America of Jews, on the small screen and the big screen, anti-Semitism has gone down dramatically. It's something that's a little harder to say in 2017 as it was in 2015, but it certainly is true overall.
Well, I guess you could definitely say if there's one ambassadorship to the universality, it's the Jewish humor for sure. You said Sholem Arachem. That's another part of the humor that you do discuss in the book, this Yiddish thing, this what is it? What's another word that we could use instead of saying Yiddish? We could say the accent. Going back to Mrs. Goldberg.
Right. Yeah. And I think, it's one of these things that I have this very fun line kind of to walk when I talk about Jewish comedy in America, which is on the one hand to make the point that Yiddish, when it was the general lingua franca of Eastern European Jews, was not funny, right? I mean, it was not funny in the way that English is not a funny language. Like, you did all sorts of things in the language that you were born into. You mourned your dead in Yiddish, and you proposed to your spouse in Yiddish, and you also told jokes in Yiddish, right? You did all those things. But in America, particularly as the generations, many of the immigrants had children who were native citizens and moved away from Yiddish as their lingua franca, right? Yiddish became kind of associated with a certain kind of Borscht Belt nostalgic sentimentality, which was wrapped up in comedy. And so Yiddish became funny for the vast majority of American Jews and American non-Jews as well, right? Where there was a particular kind of joke that could be accomplished just by putting a Yiddish word, or two in the mix.
I love when you hear politicians who have never, who are living from that flyover nation, suddenly putting Yiddish words into their sentences. A little thing goes up in my eye, and I go, am I really seeing that? Am I really hearing that? I mean, there is it certainly has gone to all culture now, and that's a good thing. Is the Bible funny?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's one of the things that I get, let's say, the most frequently asked about, because the book begins with the Bible, and you sort of say, well, isn't the Bible not funny? It doesn't seem like a funny book. And I would say two things about that. The first is that the Bible, is this great book or book of books or collection of books, and it has so much of humanity in it. And in that sense, it would be odd if it didn't have one essential part of the human condition, which is, comedy in various ways. And it does. Some of those ways are not necessarily familiar to us, or we might not have thought about them right away. So, for example, the prophets, the biblical prophets, are vicious employers of satire against people who don't get with what they perceive to be the divine program, particularly idol worshipers, right? But so so there's comedy in it, for example. There are other kinds of comedy as well. But overall, I think one of the great kinds of comedy that is an essential part of most Jewish comedy, not all, but most part, is a kind of irony of saying, yeah, we know how it works. We know how the world works. We're sort of cynical and wise, and, we have our black kind of ironic comedy. And in that sense, the Bible does not have that kind, or most of the Bible does not have that kind of irony or black comedy, because it sort of says, people who are ironic in that way, people who think they know how the world works, they really don't, because only God knows how the world works. And God can do whatever he wants to do in order to change the way the world works. So don't think you're so smart. So in that sense, it's not funny with a sort of a capital not, because it's sort of anti-funny in that way. But there's a lot of humor in it, all around in sort of nooks and crannies. And that's one of the things I investigate in the book.
So here's where I wanted to go with you next, and that is self-deprecating humor.
Yes.
That is such an interesting thing, self-deprecating humor. And I don't think that's just the purvey of Jews. I think that's everywhere, but we do it better. So I want, before I get into that, I just want to say to you, we'll answer that first, and then I'll get into the specifics of it. Talk to me about self-deprecating humor.
I feel like if we're truly talking about self-deprecating humor, I should say something like, "Yeah, well, we don't really do it so well." Yeah. But
thanks, I needed that.
Yeah, you're welcome. I do think, though, that you're right to say that there is something. I mean, Sigmund Freud, in fact, noticed this. Right? He said something along the lines of, I've never seen. I'm not quoting it exactly, but it's something like this. I've never seen, people who are as peculiarly attracted to making fun of their own character as the Jews. Right. And Freud and others, wonder whether or not this is somewhat masochistic or in fact pathological. Right. That a certain kind of comedy shouldn't maybe be, dedicated to sort of flagellating or lacerating ourselves, but should be aimed outward. I think some of that stems perhaps from the same kind of historical comedy that we talked about before. Like, here are we these schmucks who say that we're in charge, we're the chosen people, right? The God's plan is really going to end up with us being triumphant, whereas, the historical evidence doesn't seem to indicate that. That said, I mean, I always, and in the book, as you know, I do challenge that premise a little bit, which is to say that there is definitely a strand of Jewish comedy that is extremely self-deprecating, but there are other kinds of strands of Jewish comedy that are very sort of self-proud, right? And they're very aggressive, in fact, sometimes against other people. They're not about making fun of Jews at all. They're saying, well, we're actually better, or that they simply don't have anything to do with the question. But I do think that there is this strand of self-deprecating comedy that's a very important part of Jewish comedy.
Yeah, right. You raised it before because you go down different paths with the 7 strands of Jewish comedy: satirical, witty, vulgar, complaint being very big among Jews,
Yes.
and where that comes from. But I actually would say that there is the subtitle of your book is serious look at Jewish comedy. That there is something to be said, because I think it is exactly the self-deprecation, even the complaint, that saved the Jews in their most horrid moments. I've certainly talked to a lot of Holocaust survivors who will tell of some of the silly things that they did while they were in captivity, just to save the day. And they took that with them, by the way, as they got out and started, the diaspora, and tried to assimilate into American society. I'm thinking of 2 people in specifics that I've spoken to. So I think there's something good in that. It's turnaround is fair play in one sense, and the other sense is obviously it helps. But here's one I don't get. Being a nice Jewish princess, no more. The Jewish mother, the Jewish princess, the Schlemiel, the Schlemazel. I want to sing a song from, what was that show?
Laverne,
Schlemiel, and the Schmuck. I mean, the age-old tale that Jewish women don't like sex. What's with this? Where did this come from?
I think that,
By the way, we do.
Wait, I'm sorry, go on. What were you going to say?
I said, by the way, Jewish women do like sex. I've had this conversation with 1,000 friends. Go ahead.
Well, I think, one of the fascinating things about sort of the history of comedy about women, not by women, but about women, right, is that the misogyny, it's filled with misogyny, right? It's filled with women hatred. And that takes sort of simultaneously opposite forms. So there are these Jewish American princess jokes, as you say, that portray Jewish women as sexually frigid. But then there's a long history of Jewish comedy that also portrays women as sexually voracious and therefore kind of adulterous or immoral, right? And it's one of the virtues of, I use virtues in quotes here, but one of the virtues of hatred, right, that it can be logically inconsistent. It can accuse people of the same thing, of 2 opposite things at the same time. And I think that's the case here. I think that, there was, as you say, there was this big vogue of Jewish American princess comedy as frigid, but there was also this kind of comic stereotyping of sort of these very kind of voluptuous, sexually obsessed in the party records of the 1950s with people like Belle Barth, Sophie Tucker, a little earlier than that, Fanny Brice. You had this kind of good time girl model as well. And then sort of in the 90s, kind of in response, you had people like Fran Drescher in The Nanny kind of taking this Jewish American princess stereotype and kind of turning it upside down in that respect. And I think that, these kind of hostile anti-women stereotypes are kind of always in motion. And one of the things as a scholar, which is interesting, is, to trace the history of these unfortunate stereotypes and see how they kind of ebb and flow and sort of are in contradiction with each other.
I'm going to change the subject real quickly.
Yeah.
Mrs. Maisel, I don't know. I just binge watched it. It's phenomenal. But there was something that annoyed me about this, and it's probably not politically correct to say it. I'm not even sure where I am on the spectrum of it, but it is a point to be made. You can no longer make a movie where a Japanese person doesn't play a Japanese, or where a black doesn't play a black, or where, Indian doesn't play a Native American.
Right.
And yet you could make TV where a Jew doesn't play a Jew.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating insight. And I think that one of these questions, this gets into two separate questions. I think one is the sort of these evolving norms of representation, like you're talking about, these things one can no longer, I agree with you about all the things that you said. But, they're the matter of only a year or two or three of where this has happened. There were, for example, this is out of my area of expertise, but only just last year, Scarlett Johansson, for example, was cast to play an Asian character in the adaptation of a manga, of a comic book, and there was a big to do about that, but it only happened last year. I think with Jews, that conversation has not been had yet, and I think it will be very interesting to have that conversation. The second thing I would say, is that this gets into a very complicated discussion, which has been going on in academia for about 15 or 20 years, about Jews and what they call whiteness, right? Are Jews white people or not, right? Are they a separate minority and therefore they should be represented as a separate minority, or are they white people? And I think that, the only thing we can say in the time that we have is it's a complicated question. And as a result, I think there is this blurred and ambiguous and complicated debate or lack of debate that's going on about the representation of Jews. But I think it's a great point to follow up on.
You also said that Jewish comedy as a reflection of the ambiguous nature of Jewishness in itself. I'll jump off that because you just used the word ambiguous in the previous. But I do think all of that is fair conversation. I'm not sure if we're ambiguous because we think we're ambiguous or other people don't quite know what to make of us yet. Still.
Well, yeah, I think both those things are true. I think that's a good way of putting it. And I think that it's certainly the case. I mean, to take one of the examples and because it's appropriate, we're taping this during Hanukkah, that appears in that chapter about the ambiguous nature of Jewishness is Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song in the 1990s, which for that generation was a real kind of manifesto about Jewishness. And what it was, for the people who don't remember it, right, was basically a list of celebrities who were Jewish or who were half Jewish or who were quarter Jewish. And, and one of the responses that people had so strongly was, on the one hand, wow, these people are Jewish? I didn't know, but I'm proud that there's this list of all these people who are Jewish. And then another was, this is one of the things that I posed, well, what does that mean? What did it mean that these people are Jewish? What did it mean that we were proud of the fact that these people were Jewish? If they, they weren't necessarily advocates for Jewish identity or Jewish observance or Jewish community, right? They just happened to be Jewish. Or was it more than that? And that is, I think that the for many Americans, American Jews particularly, this is the position that they find themselves to be in. What does it mean to be Jewish when, many of the things that were conventional markers of Jewish identity are not relevant to them? Even in many cases, anti-Semitism. Difference
between Jewish comics and male and female comics?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, Elaine Boozler, I said this in the book. Elaine Boozler was once asked, it was a trailblazing female comic. She asked what was the difference between male and female Jewish comics, and she said $10,000 a week. And I think that's a pretty good answer, unfortunately, for the difference between, male and female Jewish comics. Now, I do think that, there is a tremendous amount of energy in the last 5 or 10 years by young female Jewish comics. I think, between Sarah Silverman and Amy Schumer and Abby Jacobson and Alana Glazer, on Broad City, and Rachel Bloom and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And now, something around Mrs. Maisels, right? I mean, the main actress is not Jewish, as you were implying. But, certainly, so these other characters, these other women, there is a tremendous amount of energy now. I think sort of and Lena Dunham, the most kind of interesting and moving forward comic energy is from Jewish female comedians.
And they do have a different perspective on all of this. That's obviously clear. I mean, listen to Sarah Silverman, and you can really catch it. Different from some of the others, and I think that's well worth dating. You teach at Columbia. Who are your students? Jews or not?
I don't check. Of course, I don't ask.
But everybody know who a Jew is.
It's funny because I think that is less true than it used to be.
No, I don't. But go ahead.
Well, I can tell you that I have students, and they want. Sometimes we do these tables at the beginning of your term, and people come up and they ask if you're interested. And there was one time last a couple of years ago that a young woman came up to me, and she looked Asian American, and her name was Asian American, but her mother was Jewish, and she was Jewish. Not only did she identify, culturally as Jewish, but according to Jewish law, traditional Jewish law, she was Jewish as well. One would have never known. So I think that increasingly in the 21st century, we are dealing and going to increasingly deal with even within American Judaism. Certainly, this is happening in Israeli Judaism, but in American Judaism, people who, whatever this means, don't look conventionally like the stereotypes of Jews that we've presented. So I'm pushing back a little on this.
Okay, you push back. Let me go to this. Let me go to literature,
sure,
and comedy, and to film and comedy, where TV and comedy, the arts and Jews. Yeah. Is there a bigger representation, considering the amount of Jews to the greater population in America, at least? And why do you think that would be, if that is true? Because I think it is true.
I agree with you that it is true. It is not in comedy. Certainly, it is not as true as it was 30 or 40 years ago, where it was. I think the figure that Steve Allen, for example, cites, one of the few non-Jews at that point, was 80%. Of American comedians were Jewish comedians. I think that the reasons for this, and this is where I put on my academic hat, were at least in some significant part structural. You had a lot of entertainment was coming out of New York. A lot of sort of the growth of entertainment was coming out of New York, and sort of after the war, and you had sort of people who were local. You had people who had a lot of experience, sort of in the Borscht Belt, and sort of cutting their teeth in sort of these quasi-professional, really close to professional level productions, and they were prepared for the rigors of live television, putting on a new show every week, and they knew the people who they knew, which were their friends. They knew funny people, and the status of breaking in was not very high, right? These were not sort of high status jobs like being a writer for television, is now. And so, you would say, oh, let's get my cousin. Let's get the cousin turns out to be, Mel Brooks or Neil Simon, sometimes, and sometimes, of course, it doesn't. Now, with the internet and with sort of much larger and much more nationalized sort of access points and areas of entry, many more people have the opportunity to get into entertainment, which, of course, is a higher status gig than it was 50, 60 years ago. And so the numbers are not as high anymore. But they're still, I think, wildly disproportionate to the percentage of Jews in the American population, generally speaking.
In the arts.
In the arts.
While American Jews shaped comedy, did comedy shape American Judaism? What's the impact in reverse on us?
That's a great question. No one has asked me that question. I think that, it's a very important question because the way that American comedians who were Jews in some ways reshaped themselves, right? This was would also have an important effect on American Jewish identity. So, you had this sense of American Jewish professionals, arts professionals, wanting to kind of create something that was wildly appealing to a broader American culture. And so they would create, in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, kind of crowd-pleasing materials, because that was, that's what they wanted to do. And that was both incredibly, welcoming, in many ways. But it also gave the impression that Jews, in a certain way, wanted to and were kind of like everyone else. They laughed at the same things. They produced material that was going to appeal to anybody, whether they were Jewish or not. I think in some ways that led to a message of saying, maybe we're different, maybe we feel kind of a little bit different, a little alienated, but ultimately we're kind of the same underneath. We're Catholics, we're Protestants, we're Jews. We're in that category. We're not Hindus, we're not Muslims, right? We're putting ourselves in that category, like American Christianity in the middle of the century. And I think that decision, has led in certain ways to a kind of American Jewish identity that is focused on continuities rather than discontinuities. And that has led to real consequences for what American Jewish identity is and what the nature of Americanization is as far as the American community, Jewish community is concerned.
All right, we've had a lot of conversation here, and it's been terrific. We entered laughing, Jeremy. You know the old saying, leave them laughing. Have at it, Mr. Jeremy Dauber.
So with all this, I will tell a joke that I've been told that Milton Berle used to like to tell, and he told the story. This shows you sort of what age it's from, but I always like this. Of President Eisenhower, and President Eisenhower, according to the joke, took a trip to Israel, and he was asked by the Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, if he would like to see the tomb of the unknown Jewish soldier. And Eisenhower, a military man, said, "Well, of course, I'd love to see that." And he goes to the tomb of the unknown soldier, and there's the gravestone, and it's written on it, Hyman Goldfarb Furrier. And Eisenhower looks at, Ben-Gurion and says, what's the deal here? I thought you said it was the tomb of the unknown Jewish soldier. And he says, well, as a soldier, he was unknown, but as a furrier, he was fantastic.
You can't top that.
Thank you very much.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah to you.
I've been speaking with Jeremy Dauber. His book, Jewish Comedy, A Serious History. For more information on Jeremy and his book, visit his website at jeremydauber.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to Talkish with Halli Casser-Jayne, the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of Resec, LLC. Be sure to tune in to Talkish Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, when new podcasts are posted at hallicasser-jayne.com. Until next time, this is Halli Casser-Jayne. It's a wrap.